Despite all those efforts, we are now at a point where we are switching from a rescue operation to a recovery operation. At this point, we don't believe there are any survivors from this accident, and we have recovered 27 people from the plane and 1 from the helicopter. The district office of the medical examiner has lead on reuniting these bodies and these people with their loved ones, and we will continue to work to find all the bodies and collect them and reunite them with their loved ones.
Good morning. Welcome to the morning meeting. There is grief throughout the country. There are questions throughout the country. And both those things exist in both Wichita, where we expect a press conference in just a minute from local officials, and of course in Washington, D.C. Any plane crash like this is a tragedy. The United States has not had many of these, any in quite some time. But what's happening now is going to be scrutinized, not just because of the sadness we all feel for the families and their loved ones and colleagues and friends of those who died, but also concerns about the implications of a crash like this happening in the nation's capital, within miles of the White House, of the Pentagon, of Congress, Capitol Hill. So we're going to talk today about all elements, all aspects of this, the investigation and the circumstances. We're going to talk about the special circumstances that exist at that airport and what we think the big unanswered questions are. And we welcome your participation. We'll talk about the other news of the day, including the confirmation hearings on Capitol Hill. We'll talk about the political and media implications of the crash. But for starters, please raise your hand if you want to talk, if you're here on the two-way platform, if you want to talk about the crash, any aspect of it, talk about how you're feeling, ideas you have about the investigation or the cause. And again, we'll get to other topics later. But for now, if you raise your hand, I'm assuming that means you're going to want to be talking about the crash. All of us, plane crashes are horrible, and all of us recognize why these strike such a chord. Again, we don't know much about who was on that plane and on the helicopter, but we will learn more, and all of us are just heartbroken about it and struggling to deal with the reality that all of us, all three of us, and many of you fly in and out of that airport on a regular basis. Let me say a few things about how I'm thinking about where we are. Then Sean and Dan will as well. We're watching to see live events. The next briefing in Washington right now is supposed to be the NTSB later today. The clip we just showed you was from the 7:30 briefing that the mayor did with local officials. So here are some of my thoughts, and then Sean and Dan will weigh in and we'll talk a bit about it. First of all, there was no one from the military at the briefing. And I think most people who are looking at this and looking at the flight path of both the helicopter and the plane are wondering more about the plane, about the helicopter. What was that mission? Just because it's a training mission doesn't mean the people in the helicopter were trainees who were inexperienced. There are a lot of helicopters since 9/11. If you're in Washington, you know there are a lot of helicopters flying around. The biggest unanswered question right now for me is, what was that mission? Why did it have to be done at that time so close to Reagan Airport? Members of Congress are spoiled. They have an airport that's like the Las Vegas airport. It's right in downtown. They can sit at their desk and get to the Reagan Airport. They can leave 25 minutes before their flight because they go right through security. And they fight to get flights direct from Reagan, not from BWI, not from Dulles, back to their state. That flight is a new flight that the Kansas senators helped secure. Reagan Airport has expanded enormously. If you haven't been there lately, you'd be stunned. An airport that close to the nation's capital, a stone's throw away from the White House and Capitol Hill, it's massive. It's the busiest, their busy runways, the busiest runway in the country. So even if it turns out, if the investigation is conclusive, even if it turns out that the cause of this accident was the helicopter, that'll raise questions about why there's so many training missions, in this particular training mission, so near an airport, so near the Capitol. But nonetheless, this should remind people that we need to have this discussion that the senators from Virginia and Maryland have tried the country to have. We can't keep letting every senator and every House member have access to a flight from Reagan back to their state. There's just not enough room. The problem is, because we paid to expand the airport, there are a lot of slots there now. So it's harder to stop the proliferation of flights. Last thing I'll say to state two obvious things. One is Sean Duffy's first activity as Secretary of Transportation was to show up and deal with this. And he's getting high marks so far, but this will test Secretary Hegseth. It'll test the new administration all sorts of ways. We'll talk about that. And it's hard to if you've never lived in the area, it's hard to appreciate how close the airport is to downtown and how complicated it can be for all the jurisdictions, federal, state, and local, two different states, DC, all the federal bureaucracies and the military is involved. So the level of coordination here on the investigation is going to be complicated. Sean.
Yeah. So first, I think I speak for all of us that the loss of life is just tragic. And, you mentioned this. I literally, live in the flight path, like right outside. The helicopters going back and forth. One just went by just a second ago. And there was a guy on TV who was going to the airport last night, and he had said, my wife texted me, 20 minutes out. And my wife and I were talking because that's how we live so close to the airport here. That's, I'll literally text and go on approach, so that she knows that, that's basically I'll be home in 10 minutes. And so it's just, it's eerie. Because for those of us who live near here, who fly in and out of here, it's a routine thing. When you come down the Potomac, if you're coming on that approach, there's two approaches, depending on the wind and the timing. You either come in from Fort Belvoir up the river that way, or from the north going south. But the Potomac is the flight path, either south to north or north to south, that they come in and land. And that's when you kind of, you go down, you get Wi-Fi, you're assuming you've not turned off your phone. You let your family know you're just a few minutes out. So it was very a moment for me just to reflect on life. And I just can't imagine, some of these people who are in Kansas. Anyway, it's a reminder of how precious everything can be. So getting to the logistics and the news of it, I think you're right. I was stationed at Belvoir. I'm familiar with these flights, not this one in particular, and then as a White House official, when there were certain things that we'd have to do, they would send a helicopter to McNair, which is on the other side of the river. But you've got helicopters that fly out of HMX. Marine One flies out of Anacostia. You've got some helicopters stationed at Andrews, and then you've got them down the river to the south at Belvoir. Training missions are just that. Part of this is on days when the president of the United States isn't here, if you go over where HMX is, Marine One, you'll see them doing touch and goes and, false assertions and just that's what you need to do as either a helo pilot or, if not here, obviously, but if you're a airplane pilot, you do touch and goes too, and you go out and you practice. But these helo pilots, because of the nature of this area and who they carry and what they do, they're in and out all the time. The Pentagon actually has its own helo pad as well. So this is a very, very normal occurrence. I thought was interesting this morning were a couple things. One, Secretary Duffy made it very clear that both the plane and the helo were where they were supposed to be in terms of their flight pattern. I have no expertise in this area in terms of, flight ops, but what I will say is that you saw the tower, make contact with the helicopter, make sure that it knew that the plane was in sight. At some point, there's an aspect, because everyone wants to talk about funding for this and funding for that. There's a human aspect of this. And when you're in that level of proximity, that's what I think, everyone wants some magical excuse. But the bottom line is when you're in that tight quarters and a helo goes up or down or sideways one side, or the plane comes, down a little quicker than it should, bad things can happen. And it's unfortunate, but there's a human piece that we just can't take out of this. As for the presser, I agree. I think between, the guys out of Belvoir, the Army, and then DOD are going to have an interesting, a lot of questions come up on that. It was interesting to me. Remember, for those people who don't know, they call it Washington Reagan Airport or DCA, but it's in Virginia. Technically Arlington, but I think part of it is in Alexandria too. The mayor was there. I think that in events like this, we've analyzed them between North Carolina, LA. I think they should have put the chief up there, let him talk about recovery efforts, and then bring people in as questioned. I thought the mayor was clearly trying to get in the spotlight there. She had nothing to offer. The chief should have taken the lead on that press conference. The idea that the federal officials spoke was a waste of time. This wasn't, I just don't think it was appropriate. I think it was between Secretary Duffy and the fire chief were the two people that we wanted to. And the sort of, I felt like it took a while to pull strings to get real information out. So it was a bit clunky. Obviously, these things happen the way they do, but they should have come with a lot more. Here's what the status is. Here's what we're doing. But the getting up and having 5 federal officials talk about how they're concerned didn't seem to me to be effective to inform the American public what was going on.
Dan, before you talk, can we just dip into the Kansas briefing and just see what they're talking about? I'm not sure. I honestly don't know who these officials are, but let's just listen for just a moment.
For a community-wide prayer, and we ask that anyone who would like to join us to come to City Hall here in downtown Wichita for that community prayer. All are welcome. At this time, our community needs to come together to support the family members who have been impacted, to come together in honor of those individuals on that flight. And as a council, we will lead in bringing this community together to pray for our community, but also move our community to know that there are resources. And as a city, we will have additional resources, especially for staff who have been impacted. And I am again grieving with everyone in our community and those in Washington, D.C. due to this very tragic incident that happened. We will take a few questions at this time.
Do you know how many of the passengers are Wichita residents versus traveling back home to DC or somewhere else?
At this time, we don't have that information, and I know that we don't have a
Okay,
manifest.
we can
at
monitor
this
that.
moment.
Go ahead and drop out. And Dan, go ahead. We'd love your opening thoughts about the whole thing. Any aspects?
I mean, just to echo both of you, your heart breaks to wake up to that news and see that it's been switched to recovery is heartbreaking and tragic. This hits home a little too because I represented H&R Block. I ran their government relations based in Kansas City, Missouri. I would go out every 2 weeks. The number of times I saw Jerry Moran and Roy Blunt and members of the Missouri and Kansas delegation was, so many. It almost became common. I also worked previously for a member of Congress, I won't say his name, from out west. And for people to kind of understand why do members of Congress push for these flights, a lot of members of Congress, you go back and forth every week. And the member of Congress I worked for would have to go to BWI. It's about 45 minutes away without traffic from Capitol Hill. For those who know the area at rush hour, it can take up to 2 hours. He'd have to fly a connecting flight through Texas. And then once he would land, he'd drive 2.5 hours home because it was a rural area. And if a member can get a direct flight from Reagan, not only is it 10 minutes away, they have special congressional parking. They're allowed to bypass security and they can kind of get on. And so it is a huge deal for your life. If you're going back and forth 48 weeks of the year, to be able to get a direct flight to a much closer airport and kind of just save commute time. And so there is a huge push. And, living in DC, like Sean, I was on the other side of the river. The Pentagon, for those who don't know, is half a mile from Reagan. You fly right over. There's the Potomac's about a 1/4 mile wide. There are 2 military bases over there. Not only do helicopters go out of those bases and go to the Pentagon, the CIA is 2 miles up the river. And after 9/11, you would frequently hear helicopters going up the river to the CIA. And so between the White House, the Pentagon, the CIA, the military bases, there are constantly helicopters moving within less than a mile of that airport. And for those who don't know, after 9/11, they actually talked about moving Andrews Air Force Base, which is about 5 miles east, to Reagan and moving Reagan out to Andrews Air Force Base. And one of the reasons that it got axed is, to Sean's point, there are neighborhoods right around Reagan and military planes are loud, and they did not want military planes roaring over these neighborhoods all night. And it's also one of the reasons they're a little hesitant to expand the runway for more cross-country flights. So your heart breaks. It's a complicated situation in that area. And you just hope they can figure it out and it doesn't happen again.
Thank you, Dan. All right, please, if you want to be on the conversation, raise your hands. Let me just say a few things and double back on some stuff. Since 9/11, things have changed, right? There was a wake-up call for the need to have more assets in place, more procedures in place to evacuate the president and other government officials, members of Congress, to protect the Capitol. So that's the reason why there's been so much increased activity. Sean is right. They're training missions. People say, well, why not do the training missions away from Washington? Some of the training missions must be done there because they're training for actual, dealing with the actual situation in Washington. You'd have to build a replica of the entire city to simulate what they need to do. However, and this will be, I think, a major focus of the early investigation, was this particular mission something specific to that theater, or could it have been done somewhere else? Because a training mission that was optional to be there, it's going to be a lot of scrutiny on that, because whatever the cause, there's just too much air traffic there. I was told that in the chat, someone asked the question of something but Dan and I both alluded to. There are limited slots at every airport in the country, right? And the airlines fight over them. And in normal airport, it's just Delta versus American. Who's going to get the slots? Who can fly where? And they compete for the best routes. They compete in their hubs, etc. DC is different because the members want flights. And as Dan made a great case for it. They're traveling a lot, doing the people's business. But the problem is you can't accommodate everybody. There can't be a direct flight from Reagan back to people's homes. And as Dan alluded to, there are very few flights from Reagan that go west of Denver. There's some, but they're not a lot. And so this buildup of Reagan to allow more members to have direct flights, again, it may have had nothing to do with what caused this crash, but the airspace over DC is too busy because of the expansion of the airport and because of 9/11. You've got civilian and military aircraft just all over the place, and that's not even talking about drones. And so we'll figure out hopefully what caused this, but there's just too much of it, and some of it is driven again by every member wanting a direct flight home, which is Dan made a good case for.
And Mark, please.
Can
I add to that? The other kind of reality to this, a lot of the FAA Congress has oversight of the FAA, and they have appropriations for airports. Members lean on the airlines with the power of the purse and intimidation to add flights.
Correct. I meant to make that point. That's what happens.
They literally, for people, hopefully I don't get in trouble with Capitol Hill, there is a special members hotline to the airport at DCA, to the air traffic control, to delay flights for when Congress gets out. You can call it, they can bump people, they can get you on flights, they can rebook you. It is a perk of members of Congress. And when the bell rings for the last vote on Thursday night, if you go to the front, technically the east side of the Capitol, all the cars are lined up with staffers because they all have their special license plate waiting to go to Reagan. They will hold planes for members of Congress.
Yeah. All right. One last thing I want to say, and it applies to today, and it applies more generally to this platform. And again, please, if you want to talk about the crash, please raise your hand. We're expert on a lot of stuff, the three of us. We're not expert on everything, but we talk about everything. None of us know much about the Danish army, but if the Danish army's in the news, we'll read up on it. All right, we'll read up on it. And sometimes we get it wrong. And sometimes we get it wrong because our opinions are wrong, our analysis is wrong. Sometimes we don't have as many facts as we should. That's the nature of this platform. We look for experts. We look to you all when people who are part of the community are experts. We look to book experts. But if we limited ourselves to just talking about our true areas of expertise, I don't think we'd be doing the platform or you a service, because stuff happens that we're not expert on. But I guarantee you, we do our best to be prepared and to have informed opinions. And Dan, particularly, is a great role model who will admit error. A little harder for
Mark,
me
I
and
think the
Sean.
broader point
Yeah.
too is that every day news organizations are having this call, like what we're
Yeah.
modeling. But they're not, I mean,
Correct.
and on most subjects. And so part of it is to see the sausage making. Who are you reaching out to? What kind of questions? But that's what's happening when you guys see the news every day on a different channel. It's not like those reporters have any clue what's going on either, or that
Yeah.
their news director, they're reaching out to people, they're asking questions, kind of like what we're trying to emulate.
Good point. Well said. Thank you. All right. So bring folks in. Again, you can offer analysis. You can ask questions. You can talk about how you feel, whatever you want. We'll run through some folks. And then again, we're going to get to talking about confirmations and some of the implications of the crash on everything else. Ronnie, welcome in. Thank you for joining. Tell folks who don't know where you are after you unmute and what's on your mind.
I'm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. I'm a moderate Republican, and I did end up voting for Trump at the end of the day. You covered almost everything politically that I wanted to talk about in this space. I listened to the air traffic control recording. It's very clear that a VIP training helicopter was given clearance visually to fly behind that airline. And for whatever reason, it did not see that airliner and flew directly into it, like trying to run across the highway. Who politically in our leadership, we have all these new cabinet secretaries, we have a new president now with a tremendous amount of experience. Who owns finally making Reagan National and the airspace across Washington, D.C. safe? And another airport, we would never clear helicopters to fly across
Correct.
the traffic pattern. That
Correct.
is the arrogance of the senior military folks that have been there for a very long time that want to be able to use helicopters to move between the buildings. Congress wants more flights. The military wants to be able to commute just as quickly between their buildings, their meetings, and wherever they go.
Yeah. So Ronnie, great question. Let me just say, as I said, some of these missions are critical. Some of this training is critical. Some of it is some general wants a piece of paper quicker delivered to him. Okay.
So I'm not talking
Yeah.
about training. I'm
No, I
talking
understand.
about
No, I
somebody.
understand. I know.
Somebody said
Yeah.
it's okay
Yeah.
for us to fly across
Yeah.
the airline
Yeah.
traffic
Yeah.
patterns.
So
to
as
me, that means one's got to go. Either the
Right. So as I understand it, there is a common frequency for communication. It's not that they each have their own separate one, but there is a frequency that they both can use to coordinate. But it doesn't matter. It's just not safe.
So hold on. But
Yeah,
the pilot says I see the airline.
Yeah,
I see
yeah.
it. Okay, probably was looking at the wrong one. He said
Right.
he saw him,
Right.
and I use the
Correct.
pronoun he. I have no idea.
Yes. Correct.
He said
You're
he
right.
saw him,
Here's
and I think he was looking this way, and he hit something
Right.
that way.
So,
My
probably-
question
yes.
is,
No, I understand. Is who's
my
going to
question
fix it?
is,
Who's going to fix
see-
it? So yeah. So here's the problem. Okay, I'll answer who I think could fix it, but here's the problem. You can't move the airport because everybody's addicted to the location. It'd be like moving the Vegas airport. Nobody wants to move the Vegas airport because people want to get to the strip 15 minutes after they get off their flight. And you can't move all of the training missions because they're training because that's where the White House is, right?
I don't want to move
Yeah.
training missions.
Yeah.
I want to. You can't have aircraft of any type. You can't have the military aircraft going across the pattern for the civilian air. One of them has
Yeah.
got to
But
end,
what- but-
and
but
that
what I'm-
takes
but
a
what I'm
senior
tell-
leader.
Yeah,
that
but what I'm
takes a
telling
senior
what I'm
leader-
telling you is if President Trump said to Pete Hegseth and the FAA and to Duffy, Secretary Duffy, no more. We can't have this. It's not completely solvable because you cannot eliminate the air traffic from the airport because the airport's not going to move, and you cannot eliminate some of the helicopter flights because they are mission critical post 9/11 to figuring out how you're going to deal with the terrorist attack on the Capitol. So there's going to be those flights, but I guarantee you, and I don't need expertise to say this, I guarantee you there are unnecessary helicopter flights, and I guarantee you we're not spending enough to coordinate it. Who could fix it? Donald Trump, Pete Hegseth, and Duffy could go a long way, and either Congress has to be involved or not for pieces of it. But those three guys could make it much safer than it is. I'm quite confident. Sean.
Yeah, I mean, there's beyond that. Just as I mean, outside my window 4 or 5 times a day, you've got the orange coastie going up and down too. They patrol the Potomac. There's actually, beyond the training, there's like actual safety missions that occur
Yeah.
all the time. There's just, I mean, to answer your question, there's a bunch of people, Ronnie, that could do it. The president could do it, Congress could act, but you either leave part of DC and the DMV, as we call it, unsafe, because the Coast Guard's got to go up and down the Potomac, right? So I get your point.
But the Coast Guard, when it's patrolling the Potomac, is not flying across the pattern 90
Yeah,
degrees.
they
It's like
are.
trying to run across the highway.
Have you ever had an approach? Both
That-
approaches from the north
Yeah.
and from the south are the river, they're the river course. That's
And there
everybody
is
does.
a second runway, which is what this one was on, because that flight from Kansas City, small planes can
Yeah.
come in on an east-west axis, which is what this was doing. It was coming in. Ronnie, you can't, I mean, there are literally military bases 360 degrees around Ronald Reagan Airport. They're all in the flight path. And by the way, here in New York City, there is a little bit of the same issue. Planes going into Newark come down the Hudson River on the west side. The main helipad for New York City is on the west side to serve Teterboro Airport, private jet terminal over in New Jersey. People don't want to hit the GW Bridge. There are tourist helicopters that go up and down the Hudson River. I have personally been running down there.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and you see them stacked over, and you have planes landing at Teterboro. JFK and LaGuardia are 2.5 miles from each other.
So crossing is completely different than flying the same pattern and flying at the same elevation. Both of these, you can see the records are clear. Both of them are at 400 feet.
Yep.
Flying across the pattern. He was like a child. He's supposed to sit there and wait and look both ways until he crosses the street. He says, I see the other airliner, and all likely he sees the airline, not the other airliner. In all likelihood, he was looking at the wrong plane in the lights, and he didn't even see what he flew into. The issue here, and Congress is going to have the same issue. They fly on those planes, as you told us earlier. They having these flights regularly cleared to dart across, particularly at night, the pattern is not allowed in any other airport in the country.
Yeah. Ronnie, just to be clear, I think the tone of our responses to you sounds like we're disagreeing with you. You're totally right. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen anywhere else. What we're doing though is explaining to you how hard this is going to be to fix. But I will say, if I were Pete Hegseth, I would say, I want a list of the next 6 months of every one of these missions that's planned and which ones actually have to be done near Reagan Airport. Every one. Because we'll see if this was really critical, nighttime activity, you know, I think a lot of them could be eliminated. Ronnie, thank you. Grateful
Thank
to you.
you.
Really, really well framed and it's a ridiculous situation. Jeff, come on in, please unmute. Tell folks where you are, what's on your mind.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
All right. Morning. I do think a tragic event like this does highlight that there are some government services that are essential. While Reagan has, specific issues, I don't think there's any question that, most of our air traffic control systems are very strained. I wonder if, the Trump policy of offering blanket buyouts to government employees, if we lose 10% of our traffic controllers, we're screwed.
I think weren't they in the exempt list? I think they were part of the exempt list.
So there were exemptions on that.
I think the air traffic controllers were in a short list of people exempt. Somebody will look for me, but I think they were. But you're right about the general point, no question. This is a reminder that there's some functions of government that can't be done on the cheap.
It also highlights that, the question of priorities, why are we sending all this money overseas to, these strange programs and such when our basic infrastructure is being ignored in some cases. I mean, there's no doubt that our airspace is going to get more crowded. We're going to have drones. We got people looking at flying cars, for goodness sake. We got, the air traffic is just going to be a more complicated issue. it needs improvement. We need to integrate AI and these other issues to try and, ameliorate some of these problems. But I just think that, it's a wake up call that, hey, it is America first, and we need to refocus on our, core issues. And along that line, Mark, I really implore you to do like a education summit or something like that, like you talked about last week or a few days ago, because that's probably one of the most critical issues facing our country. As exampled by the release of the national report card this week.
Yes, sir. We're planning on it, and thank you for encouraging it, and thank you for coming on. All right. One of the things that happened today at the briefing was that the head of American Airlines was there. Okay. This is I think driven by the new expectation for corporate leaders and the aggressiveness that companies have to make sure they don't get on the wrong side of a news story. I don't want to say the guy isn't there because he cares, but I'm quite certain that his PR team said you need to get to Washington. And so he was at the press conference today. I want to bring in Paul Wilkie, who in addition to producing the show, has a ton of experience with others, has a ton of experience dealing with airline disasters. Paul, talk about briefly your history with by coincidence, with lots of airplane crashes and how you see this from the point of view of American Airlines and their positioning as one of the biggest carriers in the world.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. This is something I follow very closely. I speak from experience. I've worked on crisis comms for two of the strangest airline incidents in history, one involving pilot suicide in a commercial airplane and an airline that took off and crashed from a runway that was under construction. I've also had friends that were on Pan Am Flight 103. A friend of a family member who was on Malaysia Flight 370, the one that went missing. So from an airline and PR perspective, what you're seeing right now is airlines by design are only going to talk about what they know right now. They're not going to speculate. And the focus, rightly so, is on the families. And one of the things I always like to stress in times like this is most air incidents really oppose the Occam's razor rule. What seems obvious and definite in the hours following the accident, is often disproven in the hours and days and weeks and months following. I know that sounds conspiracy theorist, but the more information you have, the more of a realistic picture you have.
Paul, can you expand on that real quick? Because in a situation like this, the obvious, right, is that, and again, I mean, but that it's pilot error, that either the American plane came down too quick or the pilot didn't see, as I think it was Ronnie speculated earlier, that the helicopter came in. I guess my question would be, based on like what other options would even be under consideration? If that's, I mean, that's to me the only not only obvious, but the only one.
Well, I think that is the obvious thing that's out there right now. But what you do find is it's the details within that obvious. What was going on with the pilot? What, did he oversleep? Was he disrupted by something else? Was there a equipment malfunction on the helicopter? These are the things that are going to paint a more realistic picture, a more complete picture of what really happened.
Dan?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that I'm sure we'll learn. Do you know, Paul, do helicopters have black boxes the way airlines do, that would be recording the flight conversation and data?
Well, the Embraer jet will definitely have a black box. Whether the Black Hawk does, I commercially, I know they would. Sean, maybe is there a black box on a military jet similar to what's on commercial airlines?
I believe they do.
Yeah,
someone in the chat is saying yes, they do. Okay,
I'm pretty sure they do. All right, Paul, thanks. Stay with us. Ken, come on in.
Mark, there is reporting, just real quick. Yeah. That according to Lucas Tomlinson, who, by the way, is also a Naval Academy graduate, Little known fact. Army has started next to kin notifications. It was a quote, fairly experienced Black Hawk crew. They had night vision goggles aboard, military investigators probing the crash, according to senior defense officials.
Yeah, Secretary Hegseth has suggested the same. That again, just because it's a training mission doesn't mean the crew are trainees who are inexperienced. Ken, welcome in. Tell folks who don't know where you are what's on your mind, please.
Oh, I think you're muted, Ken.
No, he's unmuted, but we can't hear him. Try one more time.
I'm outside of Dayton,
There
Ohio.
you go. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I voted for Trump, held my nose, voted for Trump the first time, didn't vote, threw away my vote the second time, and eagerly voted for Trump the third time. And what happened in the interim is I was canceled, lost my job and my career. I want process questions. So my news right now is here. International intrigue, by the way, thanks for pointing me to that. That helped a lot.
Great.
NX. So I know for a fact that in the war in Ukraine, they're losing badly. They're about to collapse. They're going to collapse any second now. I get all this from X. I just don't know who they is. Which side is the they? And we're going to have a peace treaty here at some point, and we're going to, as citizens, have to evaluate how Trump did on that. And I don't know. I don't have the information. Can you do a special issue on that?
Yeah, we
and
could. I mean, it's a big topic, and we touch on it regularly. But yeah,
I saw that. That was good.
High demand for us to talk about those topics, so we will. And Ken, I'll say without knowing the specifics, I'm sorry about what happened to you. Being canceled is a horrible thing, and I hope everything moves in a great direction for you.
I would love to talk to you about what I can do because I'm out of options, but that's not for this show. If one of you can contact me, I'd really like to find out what I can do. Okay. So my question then is, when am I going to tune in one night here, Mark, and hear you say, live from the studios in Washington, D.C., this is the Two-Way Evening News with Mark Halperin?
Well, I think the current show is about as close as we may ever get, but we're going to be doing more programming, both inside news, but also unrelated to hard news, to sports and culture and arts and music. So you'll see more programming, and one of the things we aspire to do is kind of more of an evening newscast and more breaking news program. So you will see stuff like that. It won't be from Washington D.C. though. No disrespect to Sean, but that's not a city I would live in. Thank you, sir. And again, we'll be in touch about talking about how we might be able to help.
So again, what I want is broad news, broader than the basically political. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you, Ken. Appreciate it. All right. Let's take one or two more, and then we're going to talk about the confirmation process. Larry Johnson, come on in. Tell folks who don't know where you are after you unmute what's on your mind, sir. One more time. There you go.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Mark, you mentioned that you can't simulate the reality of DC for these training sessions, but can't you? I mean, it seems to me with AI, they're recreating the whole world according to Google. Why can't they do these in simulations rather than the real world?
Sean's going to tell you why.
So when you learn to land on an aircraft carrier, our longtime watcher Greg Kelly can probably help. There's a place out in the desert where they do touch and goes, all sorts of stuff, right? And you do that before you go out.
Sean, today's a day to not use jargon, I think. So tell folks what a touch and go is.
So, the plane comes in. So if you think about it, again, this is irrelevant to this discussion, but for an aircraft carrier, when you come in, you touch and you take off. The idea is, if you don't hit one of the catapults, you want to be able to keep going and fire back up your engines and go. So if you did a training, and the idea is, okay, once you get good enough, you then go out and do it at sea. If your goal is to train someone about the Potomac, right? So you'd have to set up an entirely different site with a river, with a capital, with quayside. I mean, I can't even in my head get around what you would do. The idea here is also, like I mentioned, over at Anacostia, you've got HMX, which is Marine One. And so on weekends and when the president's not traveling, if you drive over, it's behind Nationals Park, you'll see the helicopters, and they do these things called false assertions, touch and goes. They're practicing the whole time. The idea is to keep the pilots up to speed at all times. And so if you're in the DC area and you're a helo pilot that's doing hey, we want to make sure at night we know how to do an evac or to get people out or whatever, you can't go, let's go out to Nevada, simulate that, and then come back in a week and say, I mean, it's not realistic. The idea is to keep.
But Sean, what about AI? It seems to me, I don't know, but it seems to me there probably is more advanced capacity to do testing by
Sure. I
simulating
mean,
through
again,
AI.
part of this, like, could you sit in a simulator? And I mean, I've sat in a simulator before, and they can take any airport in the world, and you look like you're landing. I guess part of it is, at some point you need the real thing. And so the question is, if you want familiarity with the terrain, you got to be able to say, okay, I've gone through.
But
I know.
isn't there a trade-off? There comes a point at which AI might be good enough and you reduce the risk.
Yeah.
Well,
You're right. There is a trade-off, Larry. And the trade-off is that if you're wrong by this much,
Right.
what does that cost you in lives and in treasure? So I guess the answer is you can always say, is there a different way we could do things? And I think we should, as a government, constantly, whether it's training missions or the efficiencies that we can get in delivering everyday services that the government performs. I'm all for it. But the
Hey, Mark, can
question
I add
is,
one more thing?
Yes, sir.
I want Dan to run for office. He's my kind of Democrat. And I think they need a radical change. And
maybe
he's
we
famous.
can AI
He's
him.
famous.
Here's the problem with that, Larry. You'd give up if Dan would win if he ran. We all know that. You'd lose him as a host of the morning meeting. So
Yeah.
Well, we can't have that.
It's a trade-off. We can't have that. So
although our kids would be happy if I left the house Monday through Friday, they'd be thrilled.
yeah.
Larry, just one thing
Go
though,
ahead.
like I used to run on the mall 5 days a week. I have witnessed when they do the Capitol evacuation training on the weekends, like at 8 a.m., because they'd halt you. I used to run around the Capitol. And they literally simulate helicopters coming in pretty fast, touching down in what was technically the western facing part of the Capitol, land, people come running out, and they take off really low at like the tree line right down the mall and turn out. And I'm guessing it's simulating that you can't shoot down from rooftops because there's trees lined on the mall, right? That is a very hard thing to try to navigate those things around the Washington Monument, kind of duck out. And I've seen it a few times. That is the type of stuff, particularly after 9/11, they are constantly practicing, is how do you get people out of tight situations very fast?
Yeah.
Well,
Larry,
two more
thank
quick.
you for. Yeah,
I would just say
It was pretty cool. I sat and watched the whole thing.
the pilots have to get so many hours in at all times too. They have to stay current. So that's the other factor here. They can't just sit idle and jump on, 30 days later.
Yeah, but they shouldn't be flying around Reagan. Larry, thank you for the question. Really
You
smart.
bet.
Appreciate it. All right. So obviously, as we said before, there's a big task for the new administration. One of the things that Republicans are now arguing, and you'll hear a clip in a moment of Tom Cotton making the argument, is this argues to confirm all of President Trump's nominees quickly because the government needs to be in place. Fortuitous that Sean Duffy was confirmed hours before this. So he was a confirmed secretary. Obviously, though, the sooner the better in terms of doing the jobs. One of the implications of this, besides the confirmation questions and besides the question of the competency of the new administration and the integration with state and local in the area, is how this distracts from other stories. If you were in a bad place in the news yesterday, it's helpful to you because for at least today and probably into tomorrow, most every other bit of news is not going to be covered, and momentum leaves a news story. It often does not return. So, for instance, the Trump administration's on-again, off-again posture towards suspending grants and payments, it'll not disappear completely, but the velocity is off of that. There's a Wall Street Journal story suggesting that Donald Trump told Mark Zuckerberg the price he had to pay to get back into the tent in order to make payments, settle a civil case that Donald Trump had, far larger than the $1 million that Facebook gave the inauguration. That story would have gotten some traction today, but it won't now. So Dan, then Sean, talk about how people with bad news stories or good news stories, how they grapple with the reality of what's happening here now.
Yeah, as you say, appropriately so, attention will be on the crash and what happened and how to prevent it going forward. I think even on that front, you said you're going to hear kind of both one view, which is confirm these people because Trump needs his team, and there's legitimacy to that. And the other side, you're going to hear a little bit of like, some of these nominees are not exactly skilled at the core competency of their agencies. They're bringing change. They have a different focus, and Trump ran on it. Like, I'm not criticizing that. I mean, I would to some extent, but like, that is what he's entitled to because he won. Is that in the best interest where you have, yeah.
Dan, hold on 1 second. Just want to listen to Secretary Hegseth. Fox Audio, please.
12th Aviation Battalion at Fort Belvoir. It was an annual proficiency training flight. And when we look at the crew, and not all kin have been notified, so we're going to withhold ranks and names at this point. We do know on our side who was involved. It was a fairly experienced crew, and that was doing a required annual night evaluation. They did have night vision goggles. The 12th Aviation Battalion, as of now, is granted a 48-hour operational pause on contingency missions as what happened is reviewed, and a senior level aviation team, an investigative team from our Aviation Safety Center was deployed last night and already is in Washington, D.C. to investigate what's going on. We anticipate that the investigation will quickly be able to determine whether the aircraft was in the corridor and at the right altitude at the time of the incident. As I mentioned, next of kin notifications are ongoing. It's a tragedy, a horrible loss of life for those 64 souls on that civilian airliner, and of course, the 3 soldiers in that Black Hawk. They're in our prayers, their families and their communities as people are notified. I can't imagine. And I know it's gone from a rescue mission to a recovery mission, and we're with all the first responders that are moving actively too. So at the Defense Department, our thoughts and prayers go out. We are actively investigating to find out what happened and why. And as we get updates, you will have them. God bless.
And that was Secretary of Defense.
Sean, super
Pete Hegseth,
unusual
who,
format
is
for such a
new on the
situation.
job.
Talk
He
about what you think about that.
I've never seen, I've done 3 tours in the Pentagon. I've never seen the SecDef do anything out of his office. There's a briefing room, Pentagon briefing room, that would be the normal place the secretary would go down and give a public briefing or an on-camera briefing. There's several other places. He's got a conference room and some other places that he can meet with the media. But I mean, I like the background just from a visual standpoint. It shows him at work with the sleeves rolled. I mean,
I
like,
was just gonna say, it looked like his jacket was off. Yeah,
And he's a great communicator. You know, TV host. He's just that was so conversational.
But it was also, I mean, I think they knew what they were doing. They didn't want him standing behind a podium in the Pentagon.
Taking questions and also taking questions. Right.
Yeah.
Dan, I sorry to interrupt you. Can you finish up?
Yeah. I'll just quickly, by the way, getting secretaries who are good on television, he's good on television. The last thing I'll just say is, yes, it moves it off the front page for Democrats. On some level, that's good and bad. Like, I feel like they've had a good couple days. They felt like they learned some things, that they scored a point for the first time in a very long time. So they can regroup. They can think about it. And, as life returns in the coming days, we'll see where it goes. But it certainly moves bad news or good news, politically speaking, appropriately so, off the front pages.
Yeah. I want to talk about the confirmation hearings starting shortly. Gabbard, Patel, and the second day for Kennedy. And I want to first start talking about Tulsi Gabbard. I believe that she does not have 50 votes against, she does not have 50 votes for her. And unlike Kennedy, I believe she starts today with 50 votes, more than 50 votes against her. She's got to turn people who are inclined to vote no and planning to vote no. But it is doable. Partly it's doable because I think she'll perform ahead of what a lot of people's expectations are. She's extremely good communicator. She really wants this job. I'm told her murder boards, her practice sessions have gone very well. And she's being introduced by former North Carolina Senator Burr, who was the top Republican on the Intelligence Committee. That will carry weight with some people. I think the biggest thing she has going for her is Tom Cotton, who's chairing the committee and has extreme credibility with his colleagues. He was on Fox News this morning, and he talked about both her support his support for her and the importance of getting her confirmed. Let's watch that, please.
I support Tulsi Gabbard's nomination. I've been working with her to move towards confirmation, and I look forward to working with her for 4 years for the badly needed reforms in our intelligence community. Our intelligence community has grown too bloated, too bureaucratic. It doesn't do enough collection of intelligence. It focuses on way too many secondary priorities that are better served in other parts of the government. Tulsi Gabbard understands this. She spent more than 20 years in uniform serving our nation. She's ready to serve again in this position, and I look forward to the hearing today where she can explain her views, her plans, her policies for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to make sure that our nation's leaders have the intelligence we need to make critical national security decisions.
Senator, is there a chance that you'll postpone this today, or is this going to go off?
No, we need to move ahead with these hearings. I think the fact that we confirmed Sean Duffy to be Secretary of Transportation just hours before this horrific tragedy outside of Washington, D.C., shows why these hearings and votes are important. We need politically accountable and responsible officials at the heads of these departments. You never know when a moment of crisis will strike. Last night it was with the Department of Transportation. Next week it could be with another cabinet department or agency. It's important that we move forward promptly with all these nominations so we have responsible and politically accountable officials leading these government departments and agencies doing their vital work.
Breaking just now, the president will brief the country at 11 a.m. in the briefing room. Sean, thoughts on both those things? Thoughts on the status of the Gabbard nomination and the fact that the president's going to come out?
Let me take nominations first. So as you mentioned today, you've got Kash Patel, Tulsi, and RFK. There was a big rally last night in DC for RFK, big Maha, Make America Healthy Again. People felt very good about RFK, how he did yesterday. I think the key yesterday, Senator Cassidy of Louisiana was a member of the committee. Today, he's chairing that committee. So I think it's interesting. But the big talk in the room, like it was like a party circuit, was where are you going tomorrow? Are you going to the Tulsi? Are you going to the RFK? Is anyone going to Kash? And I'm being serious. And the reason is, we talked about this before, that when Hegseth did his nomination, you saw the amount of support that was in the room for him. He had that yesterday with RFK, people cheering. There was clearly a huge degree of personal support behind him. There is that support today, but it's now gone over 3 hearings, right? People are deciding which one they're going to. I'll swing by the Tulsi, but the lines are long. You pick one and go. That's it. In fact, people last night had paid line sitters to sit in line so they could attend the hearing. That actually works in their benefit today, because Kash Patel, from everything that I've seen and heard and talked to people, has played a perfect game, going to senators, having one-on-one conversations with them. I think there's a generally positive but still skeptical feeling about RFK, but there's no question from everything that I've picked up that that everybody's trained on Tulsi. And if there's one thing for her, that to me is a mixed bag. On the one hand, it's kind of dissipated today, so you don't have the big attention, especially with this tragedy. But on the other hand, if you were ready to go to push back and hit back and have a good show, you're not going to get it, because you're not going to go wall-to-wall coverage like everyone else. You're not going to be able to show the president that you're a fighter, and you're not going to win the hearts and minds of the MAGA base the same way that everyone else did, because they've been able to go on television. So I'll be really interested today, because I kind of wonder how this thing will play out with Tulsi in particular. I think Kash is fine. RFK, to me, the Cassidy vote is still the X factor, especially after yesterday. As far as the president goes, I will be interested to see. I mean, if this turns into a COVID thing, does he go out, start with this, and then go off on politics and whatever? And if he can come in, stay focused on the facts about what we know and how he's deploying the resources of the federal government, this is a real opportunity for the president to step up, to focus on the tragedy, the nature of it, and how all the levers of the federal government, from NTSB to DOD, FAA, et cetera, are all being used to get to the bottom of this, to provide comfort and aid to the families who are dealing with loss. So today is a big day for President Trump. Make no mistake about it. Does he rise to the occasion, stay focused on this, or does he take the bait? I will tell you one thing that was very, very telling yesterday during the Lake and Riley thing is when the reporter yelled out at him and said, "Mr. President, can I ask you about federal funding?" Two things were interesting, and I know that, Mark, you definitely probably saw the same thing, which is he said, "Good question," right? He didn't dismiss the reporter, which was Trump 1.0 would have said, "You're a nasty man for saying that." He respected the reporter's right to ask the question. And then he said, "But this is not the appropriate time to ask that." And I thought he handled that very, very well.
Sean, I agree with you so much that if you watched Two-Way tonight, you would know that we showed that clip on the program last night, and I made those exact 2 points. Thank you very much.
He just
Dan,
wanted you to make the point
yeah.
again for the other people who didn't see it last night. Yeah.
Dan, before you address the Gabbard, Kennedy, and Trump, the White House is still getting up and running. So some days they haven't put out the president's schedule at all. Some days they put it out halfway through today. So they just put out today's schedule, having the press briefing at 11, lunch with the vice president at 1:30, and then signing executive orders TBA at 3. Dan, first the nominations and then Trump.
I think that, as you said, Cassidy with RFK, I am still curious. I mean, I think he boiled down to, if you believe that HHS kind of is supposed to run Medicaid and kind of do these bread and butter basic things, you know, you could see the kind of Dems thought that they were horrified, like he knows nothing and he's changed his positions. If you are part of the Maha kind of like going in a different direction, focusing on children's health, things like that, he comported himself, I think, pretty well. My question with Tulsi is, unlike others, like if Trump has to lean in, if MAGA has to lean in to carry people over the finish line, will they do both Gabbard and RFK, or do they just do one? Because how many times can you keep doing this? And if Tulsi does not perform great, because she's said very little, so there isn't a body of work for Trump to see, does she tonight withdraw? Like it would be a little bit of the tree fall with all this other news, and you just try to move on. Because if you're Trump, your momentum took a hit the other day. Now it's kind of going to recede. If she were to withdraw, let's say over the weekend or tomorrow night, you're going into the weekend, or you're starting the next week with another kind of piece of bad news. And so I wonder, if she does not have a good hearing, do they pull the plug tonight, push RFK over, and move on?
There's two factors in the hearing that could help her potentially. One is, if she loses the vote in the committee, will they do what is sometimes done and take it to the floor with an unfavorable committee vote? Senator Thune, the leader, poured some cold water on that, but didn't completely snuff it out. The other thing is that vote, because it's an intelligence committee, is supposed to be secret. There's a movement to see if Senator Cotton will make it a public vote so that no one can hide behind the anonymity to cross President Trump, none of the Republicans. I don't think there's a mystery. If there's a no vote on the committee, I think we all know who it's going to be. Sean?
Susan Collins.
Susan Collins. So interesting. Does anybody know why Tom Tillis is introducing Kash Patel at his hearing? Anybody know what
Get
their
on the
connection
right
is?
side of MAGA. He wants to be.
I don't.
What's their connection? What's their connection? I don't know. Is he from North Carolina? Is that where Kash
I would
Patel's
assume.
from? All right. Well, I never heard of their connection, but I see
And
Tom Tillis.
Mark, can I just say this, because I didn't say it. To Sean's point about Trump, if he, last night, his tweeting, like I thought his first few tweets were great, and then he kind of sounded like the crazy uncle speculating about stuff where I think people don't like him. We haven't seen a lot of that of him in this brief period as president. If he gets behind the microphone and starts kind of like just going off about conspiracy theories and it could have been this, and I think it will remind people a little bit of like, that's the bad Trump we don't like.
Yeah, the crazy uncle will never dissipate. But the example Sean and I both highlighted from yesterday, I mean, both those things extraordinary. Did not snap at the reporter, but also chose not to answer the question.
By the way, to answer your question, I can't see anything in Cash's background from New York. He grew up in New York, went to school at the University of Richmond, go Spiders. But I don't. I think that part of this is Tillis. The rumors were that Tillis was prepared to vote no.
Yeah.
And so the idea was that, hey, but I'm going to help your other guy real big.
Yeah. Well, there he is. He says, an honor to introduce Kash Patel before Judiciary. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for the great questions. There's going to be briefings all day, the hearings all day, the president's press conference. So we'll have a full wrap up of all the day's news as if it's an evening newscast tonight on two-way tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern time. And then tomorrow, the three of us will be back. And then tomorrow night on two-way tonight, Mark Andreessen will be our guest, my guest. So set your calendar on that to talk to him about AI and about the new administration and about the politics of Silicon Valley. Look forward to that. So thank you, everybody, again. Guys, we'll see you in 23 hours on Two-Way's The Morning Meeting. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.